Thank you, and thank you for the kind welcome. It's an honor for me as well to be starting this series for CSI, an organization I admire, and especially the work of John Eibner in the Sudan, where he has been heroic and done extraordinary work. But beyond that, I think the organization brings a intelligence and knowledge to the difficult circumstances of Christians in peril around the world, and especially in Muslim-majority countries. I am also pleased to be here in Bern. I've actually spent some time in Switzerland. I was at boarding school in Lausanne 50 years ago, and have only come back in a professional capacity for international organizations, particularly in Geneva. I've never spoken to a Swiss audience, so I'm delighted to do that. I'd like to start by looking at the larger picture, at the circumstances of minorities, non-Muslim minorities, in the pre-modern time, more or less before 1800. Now, minorities are of two sorts. Those that are recognized by Islam as having validity and those that are not. The former are called people of the book, Ahl Kitab, and primarily are constituted by Jews and Christians. The latter are polytheists, in particular Hindus, as in India. Now, there is a better position for the former than the latter, but historically there has not been that much of a difference, because when you rule India and you rule so many Hindus, you have to accommodate them too. Still, historically there was a position called the Dhimmi position, D-H-I-M-M-I, that was specific to Jews and Christians. Historically, Islam was, in relative terms, quite tolerant of religious minorities. In other words, there was an accepted place. These minorities were second-class citizens. They did not have full rights by any means. They were only acceptable to Muslims if they acknowledged the rule of Muslims and the superiority of Islam. This was done in particular, this acknowledgement, through extra taxes, the payment of special taxes, called jizya, and also by all sorts of prohibitions on them, such as a prohibition on serving in the military or in the police, or more generally in having authority over Muslims. There are many sumptuary restrictions on dress. In theory, a Christian or Jew should walk or go on a mule but not on a horse, should move to the side when a Muslim is walking down the street. Of course, circumstances differed from one country to another and one era to another, but overall, the important point here is that there was a recognized place for religious minorities. And it is interesting to note the contrast in the experience of religious minorities in pre-modern times in the Muslim and Christian worlds. And the best example of this are the Jews, who lived in both Christian and Muslim majority countries. And to quote a book that came out some 15 years ago by Mark Cohen called Under Crescent and Cross, The Jews of the Middle Ages, the Jews of Islam, especially during the formative and classical centuries up to the 13th century, experienced much less persecution than did the Jews of Christendom. One can also note that the Christians of the Middle East were better off than the Muslims of Europe. For example, in Spain, you'd rather be a Christian living in Muslim Spain than a Muslim living in Christian Spain. But at the same time, it's important not to romanticize, not to elevate this dhimmi status to something wonderful, as is sometimes the case, especially in Spain. There was tolerance, cohabitation, mutual respect. No. It was always premised on the fact Muslims are superior, non-Muslims are inferior. To put it in modern terms, none of us would accept the dhimmi status. None of us would accept the disabilities, the inferiority that went along with being a dhimmi. In relative terms, for medieval times, it was good. In absolute terms, we would not accept it. Now, in modern times, again, using the date of 1800 as the dividing line, In modern times, the Middle East, the Muslim world, was almost entirely overwhelmed by European power. There are a few countries, Yemen, Iran, Arabia, that did not fall under European power, but even there, the European power was evident. By and large, Muslim peoples came under French, British, Dutch, Russian, and other imperial powers. When the imperial powers arrived, Christian imperial powers arrived, they, of course, did not accept the dhimmi status. They did not believe that that's correct. And quite the contrary, they gave advantage to precisely the Jews and the Christians, especially the Christians, but both. Both were more willing to accept the new rulers, were more eager to learn languages, to learn skills, to become an intermediary between the Muslim majority and the new European rulers. The Jews and Christians enjoyed many advantages as a result of the conquest of Muslim majority countries by the Europeans. They enjoyed these for decades, but then, as was inevitable, when European rule came to an end, so did those privileges. And the striking thing is that when European rule came to an end, there was no more dhimmi status. The dhimmi status had been destroyed by the European conquests. The Muslims were no longer willing to go back to a dhimmi status. In some cases, things were all right, but in most cases, they were not. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how things went wrong was in Algeria, which had a small but alive Jewish community. The day the French left, the day the French imperial power left in 1962, almost 50 years ago exactly, was the same day the entire Jewish community left. There's nothing remains. They understood that their future was connected to French rule. Without the French, they could not survive. The general Muslim response to the gaining of independence was to look at the minorities, again, religious minorities, especially the people of the book minorities, and see them as a conspiratorial element, an element that's still connected to Europe, that would do harm to the independence of the new countries. And they generally had a loss of confidence. They didn't feel strong. And they, in their weakness, turned against the minorities. Other examples of trouble, unprecedented trouble, were, for example, the vast change of populations between Greece and Turkey right after World War I, or even the vaster change of populations between the newborn state of Pakistan and India in the aftermath of World War II. One saw persecution on a scale that had not been seen before. There was an inferior status. There was the occasional persecution, to be sure, but it wasn't systematic. In the aftermath of the imperial era, it became more systematic. And in this regard, it was the Jews who suffered first. The Jewish population at the end of World War II in Muslim-majority countries was about 1 million. Today, 30,000, 40,000. And almost the entire Jewish population in Muslim countries today is in Iran and Turkey, 90%, and pretty much the rest of it in Morocco, with just a handful, 9 Jews in Iraq, and who knows, 50, 80 in Egypt, and 1 in Afghanistan. You know, these are defunct communities, and they're elderly, and within a few years they won't exist at all. These are communities that were there for thousands of years. They're gone. Of course, there's Israel in the Middle East, but looking at the majority Muslim countries, the Jewish population is gone as a result of many factors, many of them connected to the creation of Israel in 1948. A resentment, a fear, a bias. In some cases, not until the 1960s, for example, in Libya And in Egypt, not until the 1960s did the Jewish population get pushed out. As the expression goes, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. Now that the Jewish population is basically gone, it is now the turn of the Christians. And to quote an American analyst named Lee Smith, being Christian in the Middle East has never been easy, but the wave of uprisings that has swept the region over the past year, 2011, has made the situation for the region's Christians ever almost unbearable. Let me read that again. The wave of uprisings over the last year has made the situation for the region's Christian minority almost unbearable. And here there are so many examples to give. And they're alarming examples, and they're in many ways unprecedented examples. We don't see anything like this in the long history of Muslim-Christian relations. Right at this moment, there's a pastor, a convert from Islam to Christianity in Iran by the name of Yusuf Nadarkhani, who is sentenced to death, could be executed any day. What is his crime? Conversion to Christianity. In Cairo on October 24th, the government forces killed 24 Christians in cold blood, just killed them with vehicles, with attack weapons. In Nigeria, Boko Haram is the name of a group that has emerged from nowhere. In 2011, its members killed at least 510 people, namely Christians, and burned down or destroyed more than 350 churches in 10 northern states. I'd like to give you, as an example of the kind of troubles that Christians are undergoing, some developments that are connected to Christmas Day 2011, just 2 months ago. And I'm drawing on the work of Raymond Ibrahim here. Nigeria, again, experienced its blackest Christmas ever, when coordinated jihadi attacks led to several churches being bombed, killing over 40 people, the majority dying on the steps of a Catholic church after celebrating Christian Mass. In Uganda, Muslims threw acid on a church leader, leaving him with severe burns. In Tajikistan, a young man dressed as Father Frost, in other words, Santa Claus, was stabbed to death while visiting relatives and bringing gifts. In Indonesia, vandals, so-called vandals, decapitated a statue of the Virgin Mary. In Malaysia, parish priests and church youth leaders had to get caroling permits, carols to sing, requiring them to submit full names and ID numbers at police stations before they could go and sing. In Iran, while celebrating Christmas, a church was raided by the state security. All those present, including Sunday school children, were arrested and interrogated. Hundreds of Christian books were seized. So some of these were violent, leading to death. Some of them were not quite so violent, but still sending a message. Christmas, the celebration of Christmas, is unacceptable. The message is clear. Christianity is unwelcome. What we're seeing as a result of this kind of persecution, including murder, is the gradual, or not so gradual, the fairly quick exodus of Christians from the Middle East. Indeed, I edited a special issue of the journal I used to edit called the Middle East Quarterly in the year 2001, titled The Disappearing Christians from the Middle East. And one finds striking evidence of this, that a town like Nazareth or Bethlehem, which had historically been majority Muslim towns, now have a small Christian element. More broadly, in the Holy Land, the Christian population is down to something like 2% of the entire population. In Turkey, there are only a remnant of the Christian population there. In Iraq, a CSI report found in 2007 that close to half of the approximately 1 million Christians living in Iraq in 2003 have fled the country. The Iraqi Christian Relief Council has said, we are on the verge of extinction. And so on, as one goes around the majority Muslim countries. One sees the exodus taking place everywhere. As Khalid Abu Tuameh, a Muslim Palestinian journalist for the Jerusalem Post, puts it, Israel remains the only place in the Middle East where Arab Christians feel protected and safe. Now, there are changes taking place that are striking. There are different countries and different Christian sects and different experiences. And historically, one found, well, let me start by giving an example of how one sect, or the leaders of one sect, are trying to appease, are trying to win favor and not be harmed by these developments. This is the Melkite Greek Catholics, who are primarily in Lebanon, Syria, and a little bit in Iraq and Turkey. The patriarch of this church, who's Gregoire III Laham of Antioch, said in 2005, "We are the Church of Islam." Think of that. We are the Church of Islam. Islam is our milieu, the context in which we live and with which we are historically associated. We understand Islam from the inside. When I hear a verse of the Quran, it's not something foreign to me. It's an expression of the civilization in which I belong. Not only does he say that he is the Church of Islam, but he blames the phenomenon of Islamism, or radical Islam, on the West. Fundamentalism is a sickness, he says, that gets loose and takes root because of the void of the Western modernity that uses Christianity only as an ideological cover. And, of course, Israel is the source of problems. When there were attacks in 2010 on Eastern Christians, he said this results from a, quote, Zionist conspiracy against Islam. All this behavior has nothing to do with Islam, the attacks have nothing to do with Islam, but it is actually a conspiracy planned by Zionism and by some Christians with Zionist orientations, and it aims at undermining and giving a bad image of Islam. It is also a conspiracy against Arabs to not deny them their rights, and especially those of the Palestinians. Finally, one more quote. Last year he said that Eastern Christians are facing, quote, demographic extinction, unquote, and the Palestine-Israel conflict is the sole reason for their emigration. Well, that's one approach, and it is not an insignificant approach. It's to say, Muslims, please don't hurt us. We will say anything that you would like us to say. We are, in fact, a kind of Muslim. We have no real identity of our own. In strict contrast to this are the Maronites, who historically, for theological and geographic and historical reasons, have been the most free. It's the Maronites who had the hills of Lebanon, who were armed, who kept the Muslim overlords at a distance. They resisted Muslim domination. They uniquely created their own state called Lebanon. Or they got the French in 1926 to create a state for them called Lebanon. Unfortunately, they were too greedy. They wanted more land, and they got a lot of Muslims with that land. And 50 years later, in 1976, they paid the price for that, and they had a 15-year civil war, which basically the Christians of Lebanon lost. They no longer controlled the country as they had before 1976. They lost their demographic strength, and they turned on each other. They no longer had the kind of unity. The Maronites no longer had the kind of unity. And indeed, the most graphic example of this would be a general, a former general, named Michel Aoun, who in 1990-91 was the hero of the Maronites, standing up to the Syrians, quite a figure. And today is in alliance with Hezbollah and is in effect a servant of the Islamist terrorist movement called Hezbollah. As a result, the Maronite position is not what it used to be. Again, to quote Lee Smith, the Maronites had always distinguished themselves as among the region's most stubbornly independent of confessional sects, but fear resentment, and short-sighted political calculation have led them today to seek protection and patronage from the Middle East's most dangerous and retrograde elements, Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah. In contrast to these two unhappy stories of the Melkite Greek Catholics and the Maronite Catholics, are the Copts. The Copts who historically have not had a voice, independent voice. Their geography was not a favorable one. Egypt is flat, and Egypt has been historically dominated by a single government. There are no hills in Egypt. And the population, the Christian population of Egypt, has been interspersed with the Muslim population. They've never had a chance to have political power of their own. By being careful, by not challenging the state, the Copts have by and large avoided major problems. During the colonial era, they did rise. They did have a larger role. They entered government. Indeed, the grandfather of Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the former UN Secretary General, was Prime Minister of Egypt until he was assassinated because he was a Christian. In recent times, the Islamists have targeted the Copts, starting about 30 years ago, engaging in violence against them. And the government has generally allowed this to happen. The government of Egypt under Sadat, briefly, before he was assassinated, and then the 30 years of Mubarak, and now the 1 year of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or put it more succinctly, the 1 year of Mohammed Tantawi, who is the effective ruler of Egypt today, have seen the government of Egypt not protect its Christian minority because it doesn't really want to defy, antagonize, get into a difficult relationship with the Islamists. It is quite willing to allow the Islamists to engage in violence and persecution of the Christians. It's almost like this is a release. If the Islamists attack the Christians, they won't bother with the government. And I wrote an article just over a year ago, right before the fall of Mubarak, in which I and my co-author suggested that Mubarak was using the Copts, or the attacks on the Copts, as a mechanism to get his own son into power. Well, it didn't work. But I think that was the goal. And right now, I think one sees something similar. Why did the government engage in this brutal massacre of 24 Copts a few months ago in Maspero? I think they're sending a signal to the Islamists that, we're basically on the same side. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the generals, are fairly primitive. And they have biases against the Copts, and they wish to work with the Islamists. They're playing... Mubarak played a double game in which he pretended to be the protector of the Copts while he was not. SCAF, Tantawi, are not quite doing that. They're openly attacking the Copts, allowing these attacks to take place. I think the future is bleak and getting bleaker. One sees the beginning of an eliminationist, a genocidal impulse that was not there historically in Islam. Not versus Jews, not versus Christians, not even versus Hindus. But one sees it now, and in particular against Christians. Here is a quote from one of the members of the Noor party, the Salafi party, the people with the long beards in Egypt. He said, "As long as Copts are alive, there will never be peace." Now, the implications of that, I think, are very severe. One hears a great deal about so-called Islamophobia, the hatred of Islam, the undue fear of Islam. But as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the former Dutch parliamentarian now living in the United States, puts it, quote, A fair-minded assessment of recent events and trends leads to the conclusion that the scale and severity of Islamophobia pales in comparison with the bloody Christophobia currently coursing through Muslim-majority nations from one end of the globe to the other. The conspiracy of silence surrounding this violent expression of religious intolerance has to stop. Nothing less than the fate of Christianity and ultimately of all religious minorities in the Muslim world is at stake. Now, all this leads to a policy dilemma. What are we in the West to do about this? And in particular, what is an organization like Christian Solidarity International to do about it? And it seems to me it boils down to two choices. Either to protect those who are living, Christians and others, who are living in majority Muslim states, or to find some mechanism to help them leave, end the problem by ending the communal existence of these ancient peoples. I certainly am in favor of the former. I certainly believe that allowing the Copts, in particular, the 2 million Christians of Syria, the several 100,000 Christians of Iraq, and other Christian populations of the Middle East to remain where they are, to remain a community, to have rights, is the desired outcome. The trouble is, I don't see how we get there. I don't see how we achieve that. It would require a shift in mentality among the Muslim population that dominates. It would require an act of will on the part of Western states to protect these peoples. It would require steps that do not seem likely at this time. And so while I'm entirely in favor of this, realistically, I don't see how we get there. And indeed, I would challenge you to come up with ideas how we achieve this. The alternative is less desirable, to open one's borders to refugees. Western countries have already plenty of refugees. You know about that in Switzerland. This is problematic in itself. It's a human. It's a painful human experience. It is a difficult social experience, economic experience. It is difficult to have immigration laws that target minorities of this sort. It has many problems to it. And yet it is doable. It can be done. One can simply invite people, encourage people, make it available, make it known to people that they can emigrate. But it is less desirable. So I think the challenge before us is how does one find a set of policies that allow Western governments to stand up against this persecution, against a persecution that is growing more severe with time, and as I say, is acquiring eliminationist, acquiring genocidal characteristics. What do we do? What do we do that's feasible? What do we do that our populations are willing to do? What policies can we undertake? It's not enough for governments simply to make decisions. They have to be, especially when they're human rights decisions, they have to be backed by a substantial portion of the population. I don't sense at this time that populations in general in the West are willing to take these kind of steps. So that is, I think, the challenge before us. And with that, I thank you and look forward to your questions.